Good evening and welcome to the new Bugajski Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK. And today I will be discussing important international security questions with our special guest on the Bugajski hot seat, Faruk Ayeti, an Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation visiting scholar at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, and a scholar with the Austrian Institute for International Politics in Vienna. But first, my political commentary on a key international topic is entitled In the Shadow of Islamophobia. Islamophobia is deeply rooted in the European Union and may have surpassed anti-Semitism as the predominant form of 21st century racism. Albania, Kosovo, and other Balkan countries with Muslim populations have become the victims of this politically manipulated prejudice. Phobias are irrational fears that trigger defensive mechanisms, such as discrimination and exclusion. In some cases, they result in outright violence against the targeted group. Such fear feeds on ignorance and collectivist thinking that all individuals in specific groups have the same characteristics. Hitler and Stalin were the main practitioners of phobia politics in the 20th century, and Milosevic applied their methods to target Bosniak Muslims and Kosovo Albanians. Current Islamophobia in the EU is based on four major fears: fear of Muslimization, cultural extinction, replacement, and terrorism. All four are exploited not only by extremists, but also by some national leaders. The notion of a Christian Europe remains pervasive, despite the fact that a majority of EU citizens are either non-believers or only nominally adhere to any Christian denomination. European Christianity, like European Islam, is predominantly secular. Nonetheless, there is a strong belief that Christianity is a foundation of democracy and human rights, and that Islam does not respect these values. Fear of Muslimization from secular Balkan societies reinforces other prejudices. The idea that most Muslims follow Sharia law and do not respect democratic values fosters fears of cultural extinction. Some politicians capitalize on these anxieties, claiming that they are defending secularism and liberalism. The fear of replacement is a theory propounded by ultra-right xenophobes. It was popularized in France by the author Renaud Camus and claimed that white people would be gradually replaced by outsiders, whether black Africans or Muslims. The process is allegedly directed by globalist liberal elites who manipulate immigration to stay in power. The replacement theory is now subsumed in the white genocide conspiracy theory, in which the indigenous Europeans will be replaced because of their falling birth rates and high immigrant birth rates. The fourth major fear is that of terrorism. The word itself has become synonymous with Islam in the minds of many Europeans. After years of bombings and other attacks by Salafist jihadists in several EU cities, it is easy to trigger hostility by describing immigrants from Muslim-majority countries as potential terrorists. It is high time for the EU to correct all four of these destructive narratives. It is time now for the Bugajski hot seat with Faruk Ayeti, an Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation visiting scholar at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies here in Washington. He's also a scholar with the Austrian Institute for International Politics in Vienna. Thank you for joining me on the show, Faruk.
Thank you very much, Janos. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Please tell us a little bit about your background. I'm sure our viewers are very much interested. How a scholar from Kosovo became an Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation visiting scholar here in Washington, and also found himself at one of the leading leading universities in the capital.
Let me start by saying, Janos, that there are many Kosovars who are living abroad and are successful in different fields. I'm pretty sure that you know also many successful cases, not just in Europe, but also here in the United States. And as a Kosovo scholar, being educated in Kosovo and also in Austria, applying for this stipend was not an obstacle, and I haven't seen any obstacle, but I have seen as a good opportunity to push forward my interest in the academic field. Moreover, the possibility to attend for an academic year in one of America's most prestigious universities is a great honor and also a unique opportunity. I would like to add that I was happy, and I'm still very happy that I have been selected by the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation, Professor Dr. Daniel Hamilton, and also by the President of Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation, Dr. Petric, and working together with Dr. Hamilton and also with Christina Spohr, who is Helmut Schmidt Distinguished Professor at the Henry Kissinger Center for Global Affairs. It's a great honor and also a unique opportunity. I would like also to emphasize that I'm enjoying here a new experience, a different experience, because we are having high-level seminars with high-level experts, professors, politicians, and also
policymakers and former government officials,
diplomats,
yeah.
and actually working, or I would say, who have a special knowledge about international developments, international relations, transatlantic relations, which in this time is very important for us. And I'm just trying to be more active, to write pieces and papers, not just for the U.S., for the newspapers here in the United States, but also in Europe. And I would like to use this opportunity, if I may, to thank the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation, Johns Hopkins University, the Austrian Institute for International Affairs, the Ministry of the Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Kosovo, which gave me the permission and the honor to be part of this program for an academic year. And last but not least, my wife Reza and my two kids, Aaron and Lisi, who actually have supported me and motivated me, not just to come to the United States, but also who actually made it possible and made my life easier.
Right, of course. What would we do without family, right?
Sure.
Our focus today is going to be on China, particularly in the Balkans. And it's a sort of specialist subject. There's not many people in Washington that study this. So, and now that America's much more, let's say, aware of the potential threat from China, I think it's a major, you've come at the right time, let's put it this way. So when did you start covering China in your work?
Actually, after 2012. After China and 16 Central, East and Southeast European countries have decided to establish the so-called 16+1 platform. Yeah, 16 European countries plus one close to China. And this was for me kind of turning point. The first question or the first reason was, how was it possible that China and 16 European countries to establish so fast, so easy, and without attention, such an important platform? The second reason was related to the question, if the 16+1 platform is going to be kind of new counterweight or new challenge, new counterweight for the European Union or the new challenge for the Western Balkans.
Right. I want to come to this, Faruk, but I want to ask you sort of bigger picture geostrategic question. Europe now is emerging, particularly Europe's East, as a major battleground between several powers, between EU, US, Russia, China, of course, potentially Turkey, maybe even Gulf states. And each of these powers has differing interests and differing capabilities. So could you give us a sort of overview or let's say a summary? What are China's global and particularly European objectives?
The Western Balkans have played an important role and still remains a geopolitical zone and a geostrategic chessboard between Western and non-Western players. I would say that after 2012, not just in Europe, but also abroad, I mean in the general term, we are facing with different Western, I mean more with non-Western players who are playing an important role, especially in the Western Balkans and also in the Balkans in general. But after 2008, after the Euro crisis, in Europe we have, or better to say, we are witness that the United States and the European Union have been engaged with more different issue, with especially the United States, have been engaged in several international issues, which actually is not related to the America First policy by President Trump. And on the other side, on the other hand, we have the European Union, which actually after the Euro crisis was not so able also to push forward the EU enlargement with the Western Balkans. So at that time, we are witness that the impact of the non-Western players like China, Russia, Turkey, and Gulf states is increasing in the Western Balkans, but also in Europe.
So in a way, China stepped in during this major financial crisis, financial downturn in Europe to inject itself. So can you explain to us what exactly is the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI? How does it operate? What are its aims? What are the objectives?
No, before we go to the Belt and Road Initiative, I should try to explain what is a 17+1 platform, because
No, we can do it either way around. Yeah, but
sure.
BRI is bigger. That's why I'm looking at BRI.
Okay. 2012, when President Xi Jinping took the power in 2012, first as the General Secretary of Chinese Communist Party, and 1 year later as the President of People's Republic of China, he started many reforms on the Chinese government. One of his starter reforms was about the Chinese foreign policy. President Xi proclaimed kind of a Chinese nationalist approach combined with neo-mercantilist ideology, which according to, or the basis of the Chinese grand strategy, China should become its place in the world that China deserves it. So in his published book, The Governance of China, President Xi has written a chapter which he has called the Chinese Dream, the Chinese Dream in the 21st century. So in order to push forward his plan, President Xi, during his first visit in Astana, he gave a speech at the Kazakhstan's Nazarbayev University, where he for first time spoke how to get the economic ties closer between European and Asian countries, between Euro-Asian countries. And during his speech, President Xi proclaimed his idea to create a new Silk Road economic belt. The aim of the new Silk Road economic belt is to connect Eastern Asia, Southeastern Asia, Central Asia, Middle East, Eastern Africa, and to connect with South Europe. Actually, the background of his idea was to reactivate and to reconnect the ancient Silk Road, which was active from 2nd century to 18th century. And 1 month later, President Xi, during his visit in Jakarta, gave a speech also at the Indonesian parliament, where he spoke also for the creation of the 21st century maritime Silk Road. The idea of the 21st century maritime Silk Road is to connect China's coast with Asia, with Africa, and with Europe. And 2 years later, the Chinese government has combined two projects, the Silk Road Economic Belt and Maritime Silk Road, and they made up the Belt and Road Initiative. Although in the books or in the newspaper we are going to find with different names, like One Belt and Road, Belt and Road Initiative, or New Silk Road, but the aim is the same. And in the last 3-4 years, the Chinese government has launched 3 other Silk Roads. Number 3 is the Digital Silk Road, which is a Chinese aim to increase the investments in the digital communication, hashtag 5G, hashtag Huawei. Number 4 is the Polar Silk Road, which is a Chinese aim to increase the investment in infrastructure in the Arctic. Since last year, China is here cooperating together with Russia to increase also the military presence, which is going to be a new hotspot between West and China. And number 5 is, last but not least, is the Space Silk Road, which is a Chinese aim to create its own space station and to replace the International Space Station led by the United States. Now, all 5 projects, all 5 Silk Roads, we cannot consider separately, but they made up the Belt and Road Initiative.
So would you say that the Chinese objective is to displace America as the leading power in the world, economic and eventually political and security power?
Definitely. According to many international scholars, the Chinese government is already pursuing a hegemonic agenda, and is already acting as a rule maker, particularly in Asia. In this regard, maybe it's worth just to compare the Chinese foreign policy under Deng Xiaoping, who was the architect of the modern China, and the current foreign policy under President Xi Jinping. During the time, during the time of Deng Xiaoping, his theory or his maxim was hide your strength, bide your time. Never take the lead.
Yeah. Well, the Chinese have always been patient in terms of their foreign policy. It's never overnight. Yeah.
But my opinion on that is that after Xi Jinping took the power in China in 2012, he's actually trying proactive Chinese foreign policy, and according also to many scholars, China is all ready to take the lead and also to shape the world order with Chinese characteristics.
Yeah, and I suppose when you're not faced with elections and you're in power indefinitely, you have more time to devote to developing your foreign policy. Yeah. When you have to compete for domestic elections every 4 years, sure, it's a problem. But let's sort of from that big picture, which is very important, I think, let's narrow it down. Look at this 17+1 Chinese platform in Europe seas. What exactly is it? How do you see that developing?
The 17+1 platform, in the first phase, it was called 16+1 platform. In order to increase the cooperation with Central, East, and Southeast European countries, China has proposed to establish a so-called institutional mechanism 16+1 platform. And the 16+1 platform includes the cooperation on economy, trade, infrastructure, agriculture, education, youth, people-to-people exchange, and also in the different fields. And with the aim to expand the investments in the European countries, China has actually spread its economic, diplomatic, and cultural tools. So the Chinese impact is continuing to grow rapidly. And member of the 16+1 platform, on the first phase, it was 16+1 platform, have been 11 EU member states and 5 countries from the Western Balkans, which have a European perspective. Let me start by Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, North Macedonia, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Poland, and 3 Baltic states.
All the former communist countries, basically.
Yeah, since the last summit in April 2019, took place the first enlargement with Greece, and now we have 17+1 platform, and 17+1 platform is integrated into the Belt and Road Initiative.
So why are the Balkans so important? Is it because it's an inroad into Europe? Is it because they're poor? Is it because they're more open to the corruption that comes along with investment from China?
This is a great question, but allow me to explain it chronologically.
Sure.
First, China's presence in the region is not new. China's presence in the Western Balkan is not for first time, because China's presence in the Western Balkan actually get back to after the Second World War, when Albania and the former Republic of Yugoslavia have played an important role on the process of recognition of People's Republic of China as the only legitimate representative of China to the United Nations in the 60s and in the 70s. Second, we had also the case with Enver Hoxha, who wanted the former communist leader of Albania, who wanted to engage and to have better relations with China, and he was able to realize his first visit in Beijing in 1956. We had also the case with Tito, who wanted also to increase the bilateral relation with China, and he was able, but later, to realize his first visit in Beijing in 1977. And we had also the case with Bulgaria, pardon, and Romania.
Ceausescu, of course, at those times. Yeah.
But the Sino-Balkans relations had, after the Second World War, had ups and downs, and it's also worth mentioning that their relations have actually been affected by the Russians' interference. The second important issue, in my opinion, is related to the Balkans geography. The geography is the destiny. Um, because the Western Balkans, or the Balkans as a region, plays here actually an important role, or as a gateway, as a transit way to the European Union market. Actually, since taking over the port of Piraeus in 2008 by the Chinese company COSCO, now the Chinese companies can transport their goods and services from China through seaways to the port of Piraeus. And from the port of Piraeus...
Do they own the port completely? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Right.
And from the port of Piraeus through the Western Balkans to the Western countries. And the Chinese company COSCO, which is one of the biggest shipper Chinese company in the world, has invested in the port of Piraeus more than $1 billion. Which is actually one of the biggest Chinese investment in Europe in the framework of 17+1.
Do they bring in Chinese workers to Piraeus, or is it just resources? Is it just finance?
Sure. And it's also worth mentioning that since taking over the port of Piraeus, the port of Piraeus has become one of the fastest growing port facility in the world. And this is actually the aim of the Chinese government, to purchase or to take the ownership in key ports, or in key harbors in different regions.
Key hubs, basically.
Yeah, around the world.
Isn't it the same in Rotterdam, in Holland?
Yes.
It's also owned
It's also
by
the same.
COSCO.
Yeah.
So that's the gateway into Northwest Europe, Scandinavia and so forth.
The Chinese government has, after 2 speeches of President Xi Jinping in Astana and in Jakarta, the Chinese government has launched 6 international corridors. And 2 of 6 international corridors will connect China with Europe. Let me mention just briefly 2 importance. The first one is the Euro-Asian land bridge, which is an international railway which will connect the eastern region in China, Lingyuangang, through Xinjiang, Astana, Moscow, Duisburg in Germany, and will end in Rotterdam, in Holland. And the second important international economic corridor is supposed to connect Central Asia in Xinjiang through Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Iran, Turkey, and it's also supposed to connect with the Balkans.
Okay, so that will go across Anatolia into the Balkans, basically.
Yes.
So people would say, well, that's good, it's trade, it's investment. What's wrong with Chinese investment?
The problem is, or the Western concern is related to the so-called debt trap diplomacy. Because according to the Chinese government, this is not a debt trap diplomacy, this is a win-win approach. This is a win-win cooperation, which means that both parties will win. But some of the Chinese investments are actually debt trap diplomacy.
Could you explain that to us?
Yeah, sure.
So it's clear, yeah.
Because China seeks to get more economic and political leverage. And some of the Chinese investments are not FDI, foreign direct investments, but rather loans, which, as I mentioned, the China is going to gain more political and economic leverage, and also to get more access to the market and resources of the borrowing countries.
Loans with high interest, I presume, as well.
Yes. But the problem is, what about the countries which are not able to pay off their loans? The best example is the port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka, where the government of Sri Lanka was not able to pay off on time their loans to the Chinese state-owned banks. And the Chinese state-owned bank took the ownership. And by taking the ownership, China is going to gain more political and economic leverage. And this is exactly why the Western countries have criticized China for their debt trap diplomacy. And according to the Chinese government, this is not a debt trap diplomacy. But actually, this is a debt trap diplomacy, because according to the Chinese government, we are going to win both China and the borrowing countries. But in different countries around the world, we have seen that the only winner is China, because China wins twice.
Is it clear in the contracts, if you don't pay up, we take possession of the property that you have paid for, that we have paid for, that we have given you a loan for?
This is the next concern about the Chinese investment, because some of the Chinese investments or loans or contracts are not available, are not public available.
Not transparent.
Not transparent. And many contracts and also many loans have been accompanied by the lack of transparency.
Mm-hmm. So you touch upon the economic, and I'm going to go country by country, including starting with Kosovo. But let me ask you one more question. You said it earlier, it's not just economy, is it? I mean, they're trying to establish these people-to-people contacts, tourism, cultural, academic, media linkages with the region. Could you explain that a little bit?
Sure.
As well?
The number of Chinese tourists in the Balkans have been increased. Serbia, for example, became the first European nation to sign an agreement with China on the process of visa-free travel.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the Albanian, Bosnian, and Montenegrin government have signed an agreement with China on the process on abolition of visa requirements. China has spread also its media and broadcasting and media.
Media empire, basically.
Media infrastructure actually in the Western Balkans, and many Chinese media also are located in the Western Balkans, like in Tirana, Skopje, Belgrade, Sarajevo.
But broadcasting
Zagreb.
in local language, yeah.
Yes, and let me mention just briefly, for example, China Global Television Network, Xinhua, China Daily, China International Internet Center. They have opened bureaus actually in the Western Balkans, or the China Radio International has engaged correspondents from Tirana and from Belgrade, and they are producing news in Albanian and in Serbo-Croatian languages. In this regard, it's also worth mentioning that the Chinese media in the Western Balkans are promoting China, not just a global trade partner, but also the Chinese authoritarian approach, and also the Chinese Communist Party as a model of economic modernization, which is going to be a challenge for the Western Balkans. In the cultural level, I would say that China has spread also its presence in the region, not just with the establishment of Confucius Institutes. For example, up to now we have 2 Confucius Institutes in Bosnia and Herzegovina, 2 in Serbia, 2 in Montenegro, 2 in Albania, and 1 in North Macedonia. After 2010, I would mention also that the Chinese embassies in the Western Balkans are playing also an important role, not just to promote China as a reliable partner, but also as to establish kind of a network of united front with political parties, local politicians, media, business sector, youth, and society.
With presumably academic exchanges, cultural exchanges, visits,
Yeah,
sports, entertainment, music, I mean, presumably across the board.
But definitely, not just in media or on cultural level, but also in different fields like academia, youth to all, people-to-people exchanges. The cooperation has been increased and intensified, particularly after 2012.
Let me ask you now specifically with specific countries, starting with Kosovo. How would you describe China's policy, particularly since the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, which liberated Kosovo from Milosevic's control? How would you describe China's policy in terms of doesn't recognize Kosovo in National Security Council? Does it want to develop relations with this new state?
No, first, China stands during the Yugoslav wars in the 90s was very clear. China took a neutral position, and the Chinese representatives have always pointed out to avoid the using of force and to find a solution between conflicting parties. In the Kosovo issue, the Chinese stance or the Chinese position was also very clear. For the Chinese government, the Kosovo case was an internal matter of the former Republic of Yugoslavia. And during the Kosovo War, 1998-1999, the UN Security Council has adopted 8 resolutions on the Kosovo issue. Just in 2 cases, China voted in favor. And in 6 other resolutions, China has just abstained. In this regard, the bombardment of Chinese embassy in Belgrade by NATO in May...
Not deliberate, I must point out.
In May 1999 has affected to get Serbia and China closer. It's true that unfortunately China still hesitates to recognize Kosovo's declaration of independence. Second, the non-recognition Kosovo by China is more, according to many international scholars, is more related to the to China's domestic policies, and China actually seeks to avoid setting a precedent case for Taiwan, Tibet, or Uyghur region in Xinjiang. And on the other hand, I must say that also the Kosovo representatives have been very careful on their statements regarding China, because China, as a member of the UN Security Council, could play an important role on the international establishment of the Republic of Kosovo. By the International Court of Justice in The Hague, China has supported the Serbian position. And China handed a written statement, just 7 pages, against Kosovo, and interestingly, China has not made any oral statement, which is seen a positive step. In 2007, the Chinese government has decided to establish in Kosovo a liaison office, which is seen actually as a pragmatic step to increase the economic cooperation between Kosovo and China. And after 2009, the Chinese government has also decided to recognize Kosovo's passport. So the Chinese offering visa for Kosovars who would like to visit or to conduct business with the...
So is this a step-by-step approach, you think, towards recognition?
I hope so. That it should be step by which should come to the recognition, because the aim to comparison Kosovo case with different states around the world is unlogical, and because Kosovo case is completely different case and is not comparable with Taiwan, Xinjiang or Tibet. So I would like also to mention that after between 2012 2016, in Kosovo have been registered 410 Chinese businesses, and
so they do consider Kosovo as part of the Belt and Road Initiative?
Indirectly, yes. Indirectly, yes. Because China, as the Chinese government is trying to promote itself as a neutral partner, which is ready to conduct business with different parties who are interested to have business with China, actually. And according to International Monetary Fund, in 2018, the trade between Kosovo and China was very unbalanced, because Kosovo's export to China amounted just $2 million, and Chinese imports to Kosovo around $400 million.
Well, one interesting political diplomatic question here is we often hear China won't recognize Kosovo because it could set a precedent for Taiwan. But if I play devil's advocate, surely China could seek a precedent for Albania unifying with Kosovo as a precedent for its potential unification with Taiwan in the future.
I don't like to interfere in this. This is...
I mean, I'm saying this is a potential. If China wants to disrupt things a little bit, if China wants to play, let's say, a spoiler role in the Balkans, it could go this way. You don't answer this. I'm just putting this on the table as a possibility. See, there's nothing that I avoid in asking about China. How important is China then for the Serbian government? I mean, China has, I suppose you could say, traditionally had good relations with Serbia. By the way, neutrality I don't consider a policy. Neutrality, you often favor the aggressor. If you sit on the sidelines, for instance, when Serbia was attacking, cracking down, conducting a potential genocide in Bosnia and in Kosovo, that's not neutrality to me. That is taking a side by not doing anything active. But tell us now, how are Serbian relations now with Serbia's relations with China, economically, politically, diplomatically?
This is a huge topic, because in my opinion, Serbia is not the closest China's ally in the Western Balkans, but also in Europe. Why I'm saying that? In 2017, the former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary Hoyt Bryan said to President Vučić in Belgrade that Serbia cannot sit on two chairs, meaning West and Russia.
Right.
But in my opinion, Serbia is not sitting on two chairs, but on three chairs, including China. In 2009, the former Serbian President Boris Tadić visited Beijing and met the former Chinese President Hu Jintao. The aim of his visit was to create an international network against Kosovo's declaration of independence, because it was in 2009. And they signed an strategic agreement. And since 2009, China is one of the main pillars of the Serbian foreign policy. Because the Serbian government has identified four strategic partners: Russian Federation, European Union, People's Republic of China, and United States. And President Vučić, in order to increase the cooperation, not just with Moscow, but also with China, has established or has taken care to establish a national council on the coordination and cooperation with the People's Republic of China and also with the Russian Federation, and has appointed his former boss, the hardliner Nikolić with anti-Western approach, to lead that council. And Nikolić was president of Serbia when President Xi Jinping visited Belgrade in 2016. And Xi Jinping is expected to visit Serbia again this year. This was confirmed by President Vučić himself in a message for New Year spoken in Serbian and in Chinese language. And in my research, I try to compare the bilateral meetings, because as you know, we in political science, we use the bilateral meeting as a good indicator to measure how good or bad are the relations between two countries. Between 2016 to December 2019, the Serbian president met the Chinese president 4 times. Between 2012 2019, the Chinese prime ministers and the Serbian prime minister have met 16 times. And I have also compared the bilateral meeting with European countries, between China and European countries, and I couldn't find any another European country who actually met more time the Chinese prime minister as the Serbian prime minister did. In the economic
Has he met
level,
more times with the Chinese leaders than with Putin?
No, with Putin it was
Even more.
Even more.
Yeah.
And President Putin has visited Serbia 4 times actually since he came to power. On the economic level, Serbia is the main recipient of the 17+1 platform with around $10 billion investments, which most of the investments, Chinese investments, are not FDI, foreign direct investment, but rather loans, which means that the Serbian government has to pay off to the Chinese state-owned bank. Most of the Chinese projects or companies have been engaged to build roads, railroads, power plants, and most of the Chinese projects actually have been accompanied by Chinese loans, Chinese contractors, Chinese suppliers, Chinese workers, and Chinese materials. So everything was made of China. Well, the best example to elaborate it is the building of the so-called Chinese Serbian friendship bridge in Belgrade, where a Chinese company has built a bridge with Chinese loans, with Chinese workers. More than 7,000 Chinese employees have been engaged to build the bridge, and they use also the Chinese material.
I remember even during Milosevic's time, China was breaking sanctions on Yugoslavia, on Milosevic, and Milosevic did allow in Chinese workers, Chinese investment. Chinese citizens came and settled in Belgrade.
Yes, but if you compare the Chinese impact now in Serbia and during the time of from Milosevic,
it's much bigger, I know.
It's much bigger. Yeah. It's much bigger. For example, China.
What I'm saying is the seeds were planted there.
Yes, yes. But now you have mentioned the Chinese in Belgrade. The Serbian government has decided to recognize the Chinese as a minority in Serbia. And this is the for first time actually in the European history that we have a
Just
Chinese.
to complicate our study of interethnic relations in the Balkans, right?
Yeah, and the most significant project in Serbia from the Chinese investments will be the construction of high-speed railway between Budapest and Belgrade, which actually the Hungarian and Serbian government has signed an agreement with a Chinese bank, Exim Import Bank of China, to finance the building of this high-speed railway. And the Chinese aim, in my opinion, in this regard is very clear, because China would like to connect Budapest with Belgrade, from Belgrade to Niš, Skopje, and from Skopje to Thessaloniki in Greece.
Now to Thessaloniki, and presumably further down to Piraeus through mainland Greece. But let me ask you a question on the military side, because this is where it's a little bit worrying. Military exercises with China, purchasing Chinese, Belgrade in other words, armed drones, Chinese police officers training Serbian police officers or joint patrols. Could you explain this a little bit?
Sure. Serbia became the first European nation to buy Chinese armed drones, the first European nation. And since 2019, actually, the Chinese police officers are patrolling with Serbian police officers in the streets of Belgrade, and also the Serbian soldiers are taking part in the military exercises with the Chinese counterpart. In the security level, the Serbian Ministry of Internal Affairs have signed an agreement with Huawei on a strategic partnership, and also to develop Serbia's 5G network. And despite the concerns raised by the US government, Serbia has not changed its mind.
One more country I want to cover, because we have fairly limited time, but as you mentioned, China and Albania had a pretty close alliance in Hoxha's time, at least between about, 66, 67 and 76, height of Maoism, I suppose. Some even considered Albania to be the outpost of Mao Zedong of China in Europe. Has this relationship, how is China trying to revive these relationships? What are the main projects and avenues of penetration into Albanian society now?
I would say that Albania is the most experienced country from the Western Balkans
towards China.
Towards China. And after 2012, the Albanian and the Chinese cooperation have been increased, actually, because Albania is one part of the 17+1 platform, and also part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And China is actually active in Albania in different fields. For example, a Chinese company, Everbright, has bought the operating company at the Mutter Teresa airport, or another Chinese company has bought the rights in the two main oil fields in Albania, in Fusharas and Kuchova. And this Chinese company has invested more than $415 million in Albania, which in 2016 China was one of the main FDI investor in Albania, and also in the cultural fields and also in media. The Chinese impact is continuing to grow rapidly. I have mentioned that the Chinese government has supported the establishment of a Chinese institute at the University of Tirana, and the second Chinese Confucius Institute is established at the University of Durrës, and also many Chinese companies like Huawei has opened its branch in Tirana, and also in the cultural level and media level they are very active, actually.
So what is it that Albania should be particularly wary of? Is this the debt trap question?
Sure. This is the second, the main reason, not just for Albania, but also for all Western Balkan countries.
I think Montenegro is also affected by such a
because in Montenegro, Montenegro has signed also an agreement with a Chinese state-owned bank, Exim Export-Import Bank of China, to finance the railroad between Bolyare and to connect the port actually in Adriatic Sea and to connect with Serbia, which will cost more than $1.3 billion. And this is going to be a new challenge for the government of Montenegro.
Right.
The second important project, not just in Albania but also in Montenegro, is the building of Blue Corridor, which will connect actually from Slovenia through Croatia, Bosnia, Montenegro,
coast,
Albania, and will end in Greece.
That's the old Roman, which was it? I can't remember the number of the ancient Roman road down the coast.
Yes.
But let me ask another sort of big question that I think a lot of people here in Washington are fascinated about. What is the difference between Chinese and Russian investment, a Chinese and Russian role, particularly in the Balkans? Are the objectives different? Are the means different? Is the timetable different? How would you describe? And also, is there competition between them over this region?
Definitely, because they are having actually different aims. If Russia exactly is going to increase its presence in the region, the result is clear: to increase the instability. In contrast, we have the Western players like United States and European Union, which are actually active and engaged in the Western Balkans more than 2 or 3 decades, and the result is clear: to increase the stability, to promote democracy, rule of law, and so on. And China, as a newcomer, as a new player, with no specific ties or special ties with the Western Balkans, after 2012, the Chinese impact or the Chinese influence has grown rapidly. In comparison to Russia or to Turkey, the Chinese engagement is completely different. Why? Because the Russians or the Turkish influence in the Western Balkans is also connected or related to their historical religions and cultural ties. For example, the Russian Federation pretends to be the protector for the Slavic Orthodox population, and Turkey for the Muslim population. And China engagement in the Western Balkans, I would say, is not connected to such an ethno-national narrative. Moreover, and this is the big difference between China and Russia, the Chinese President Xi Jinping and also the Chinese Prime Minister Li Keqiang have publicly expressed China's support for the EU enlargement, which was not the case with the Russian Federation.
Right. Why does China want EU enlargement? Why does China want the Western Balkans in the European Union?
According to many scholars, China is supporting the EU enlargement with the Western Balkans because this is on Chinese interest.
Economic interest.
Sure.
And diplomatic interest, presumably, as well, if they have countries that support China within the EU.
They are just trying to first of all, the footprints, after that to gain more political and economic leverage to the countries. And they are also going to gain or to have more access to the resources and to the markets of the borrowing countries. And so China then, after that, can increase its impact both economically and politically.
A couple more questions. One, we're in the midst, or maybe at the beginning, of this coronavirus epidemic, which is turning into an epidemic. We don't know how it's going to work out. We don't know whether it's going to get worse, whether there'll be immunization found and it will be handled and it will dissipate. But always at the beginning, there's fear that this could grow. If this continues to grow in the way it has recently, how will this impact on Chinese policy, on Chinese investments, on Chinese role in regions like the Balkans, on the whole BRI initiative? And presumably there'll be some sort of impact, more hesitation to, let's say, if China's economy is hit hard, presumably there'll be less capabilities, resources for investment. But on the other hand, more suspicion about Chinese investment in Europe.
The coronavirus is actually a challenge for the world, but I hope that is not going to be kind of threat. Regarding the coronavirus, particularly the Western countries are concerned about the impact which could have. particularly in the Western countries. But in the economic terms, up to now has had a big impact, because most of the companies who actually are working together also with Chinese companies are actually afraid, and the concern has grown after in the last 2 or 3 weeks. And I can just mention that in the Western Balkans, they are also very concerned how it's going to deal actually with this issue.
Well, you know, there's Russian state disinformation that it's America's CIA that invented the virus, like with AIDS, but this time to try and undermine the Chinese economy. Now with these social networks, you know, disinformation, propaganda, basically lies are easily spread and believed. So there's a geopolitical aspect to all this that's used by particular powers, particularly Russia.
Yes, but in this regard, I mean, is not new from the Russian spy or from the Russian government.
It's not new, but presumably behind it is the idea that you can further spoil American-Chinese relations to your advantage. Let me ask you though, what should U.S. policy, particularly America, looking at how a region where we've invested so much politically in terms of troops, diplomatically, economically, the Balkans, if this falls increasingly under Chinese economic sway and potential diplomatic sway, how should America approach this? What should we be doing?
This is not just a question for the Americans, but also for the Europeans, actually.
Of course.
In 1989, the world has experienced two important lessons, but different. The first lesson was with Russians' characteristics, where a wave of democratic revolutions in the Central East and Southeast European countries brought more democratic reform without violent clashes and without bloodshed. The second lesson was with Chinese characteristic on Tiananmen, where the efforts for more democracy were put down by force.
Right.
During that time, the United States and the European countries have worked together and as an alliance. 30 years later, the United States and the European countries are acting with complacency in the crisis and forgetting that the list of the challenges is not the same as 30 years earlier.
Yeah.
Now is more unpredictable. 30 years later, I do believe that the United States and the European countries are not looking to learn from their own experience how to deal better with Russian bear and with Chinese dragon.
On that note, one last question. How much longer are you in Washington, Faruk? When does your fellowship here finish?
Actually, I'm here since September last year, and I will be until the end of May.
Until the end of May. There probably won't be an opportunity this time, but at some point in the future, maybe get you back on the show, particularly to talk about Turkish, because you cover both China and Russia and Turkish influence in the region. But I think we need to devote an episode at some point to Turkish role in the Balkans. Faruk Eti, thank you very much for appearing on my show.
It was a pleasure to be with you.
My pleasure also, and I'm sure it's going to a lot of information, a lot that's new, I think, for our viewers and listeners. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And good luck in your work.
Thank you so much.
We'll break now for a few ads. Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues at VOA and at RTK. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Miro Pavshim.